And we are going to also do a panel right now with 4 of our influencers and talk a little bit about the power of content. Why do they write? What's it like writing? How do you measure the ROI on this? When you're sharing content, why do it? How do you build up your own brands? What's the value you're getting out of it, and what are the biggest mistakes and learnings that they've had from it? So I would love to invite them all up. Is everyone here? Let's see. Yes. Why don't we do this with Hunter Walk? Hunter is a former Google product manager, led Google's acquisition of, after Google acquired YouTube, Hunter really led the entire process. He's now a venture capitalist and his firm is called Homebrew, right? And Hunter has been an amazing success as an influencer. Esther Dyson, Esther, come on up. Esther is a well-known venture capitalist and cosmonaut. Is that fair? All right.
And healthcare.
And healthcare, whatever. We will get into what Esther is doing in healthcare in a second and how she's using content in that. And then Heather Hiles. Heather she is, great. Thank you, Heather. Heather is the CEO of Pathbrite, which is taking the idea of how do you create portfolios in education and share them and build off of them. And is that a fair assessment, Heather?
Yeah.
She'll explain a little bit more in a second. So want to just start the conversation off, and I'll join you guys here in the chair. Talk a little bit about, why you are creating content. And Heather, maybe we'll start with you. We've talked a little bit about this. Why don't you talk, if you wouldn't mind, about what kind of content it is you're creating and what you are and why you're doing it?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here. And what I would say is that we're in an industry that is undergoing a lot of change right now. The education industry, how we view learning and teaching and assessment is a big deal. And so there's a ton of content, frankly, and there's a real need, from my perspective, to be able to communicate with other people, teachers and students and folks in the world about how they perceive all the changes that are underway. And so this is a wonderful way for me to, as you mentioned earlier, I walk around with all these different hypotheses and ideas and notions, but to put something out there in the world and then to receive some feedback, I find that not only do I receive feedback, but actually ideas and thoughts that I have get better developed and really stress tests through these through the comments.
But you're the CEO. Is it worth your while to be putting these thoughts out there and spending time crafting these messages?
I had someone asked me that exact same question today, and I would say yes, and I'll tell you why. Because I am asked to continuously describe for investors and for potential customers and for just learners at large how I believe portfolios can improve learning and teaching and assessment. And so I find that this is something that I personally need to be involved in, which is sharing a formulated set of thoughts with folks and receiving real feedback. And so honestly, this is the one social media activity that I personally am really involved in.
Great. Hunter, would you mind weighing in on this? Hunter has a very, you talk about authentic voices. Hunter is not afraid to share at all what is on his mind. Even when he was at Google, was very opinionated and developed his own personality within the company. Talk a little bit, if you would, about what it was like becoming a thought leader inside of a large company that doesn't necessarily have standout personalities, and also how that's helped you in your current.
Or I should say the standout personalities are usually because they've invented incredible algorithms and self-driving cars,
exactly.
not because they've hit publish. I think for me, writing in general is sort of the closest that I'll ever get to labor. The delivering a child, not the working, because what happens is there's just something inside of me that I feel like I need to get out, and I just sit down and write. I don't write drafts. I don't worry about whether it's going to be taken exactly the right way. And I guess sort of unintentionally, I found when I was at Google that it started to help me really first and foremost as a hiring manager. So when I joined YouTube after the acquisition to run the product team, took the team from about 4 people down to 2 people and then up to 24 people. And this was during a period of time where Google was still seen as a great place to work, but it was no longer the only choice for the smartest young product managers. They were deciding between Google, Facebook, or increasingly starting their own company via something like Y Combinator. And so, while Google as an entity was well known, I think employees always they work for a person, not a company. And so to be able to be out there with a point of view, be able to have folks see that I was, transparent and part of the broader conversation, I think gave a lot of the people who ended up working for me some confidence that in 2 to 3 years at YouTube, they could learn not just from what they were doing, but from who they were doing it with. And so helped us bring on some talent that might have otherwise not thought of working for a company that already had tens of thousands of people there.
So when they would come in to sit down with you, they already knew a little bit about you. They knew where you were. They felt like they knew you enough that they would know whether
they didn't know what I looked like, since I tend to use a cartoon avatar,
right.
much to your dismay.
I know, we got to get
but they at least knew my writings.
Right. And then I want to talk about how that's powered Homebrew also. But Esther, I would love to, you are starting something new here. You obviously, you're a long-time writer. Your background is in writing. But we were talking a little bit about how, as you've moved into the healthcare space, the writing has taken on a different, urgency. Is that the right way to phrase it?
I come to this from a very different perspective because I had a newsletter and the company around it for 25 years. So I'm a former journalist. I was an altar boy in the Church of Journalism. I was a fact checker. And of course, the world of writing and publishing has changed dramatically. And I won't go on for too long, but the thing that distinguishes LinkedIn for me is the audience. Mm-hmm. For a while, I wrote for Huffington Post, and that was not a very satisfying experience because they do have trolls. And it was a kind of random audience. At LinkedIn, you have a much better sense of who you're getting. The reality is I'm an influencer. I just checked. I've done, I think, 15 posts so far. And I'm just beginning to think how to use it for HICCup, which is a not-for-profit. What I'm doing for HICCup right now is we have a HICCup group on LinkedIn.
Do you want to describe what HICCup is?
Yes. Thank you for the ad. HICCup stands for Health Initiative Coordinating Council. And I don't know everybody in the audience, but if you think you have a branding problem, try branding something that is a not-for-profit with no real business model. Our idea is to find 5 communities that want to become healthier and save money at the same time. The criteria for that are kind of complicated. It sounds like something everybody is doing, but it's different because we're much more data-driven and we have business models. So Health Initiative Coordinating Council and HICCup are memorable, but what it actually stands for, what it means, is much more complicated to explain. And so I hired an executive director so that this would not be yet another, not that I'm a billionaire, but the billionaire pet project where there's no business model and the people don't need to actually do much because the billionaire keeps funding it. I need to get much better at explaining what it is. I need to build a community of people who are excited, even though we don't really have any work for them to do until we pick our 5 communities. At that point, then we'll end up probably with community-specific groups.
And so what's the difficulty with using content for that? Or how do you see the role of content in creating this awareness or in building it up?
As you both said, the role of content is to give us an identity, not as either a brand or something strange, but as individuals with motivations, make it more personal, make it something they want to follow. How is HICCup developing? What are we up to? I feel awkward saying this because we haven't really done it yet, but the opportunity is to be very open about what we are doing, explaining the challenges we face in trying to pick the 5 communities. Right. And I'm dealing with, so you talked earlier about people being candid and personal. Being candid and personal about how you're operating your business. I still haven't gotten to the point of, well, we walked into the city council in Milwaukee and they asked us this and we were embarrassed. but that's what I want it to be like. I
Right.
want people to feel that they can peek in and see how we're doing. And there's going to be a fine line, just as there is personally, to talk about yourself without dissing your boyfriend, for
Yeah.
example. You know,
Right.
how do we talk about our clients without having to go get like a signed document of clearance before we do that? And we're learning, but this audience is the place I want to learn with, because this is the audience I want to reach.
No, it's a great point about the idea of being able to, of not waiting for the clearances to come through and knowing how to very quickly write something. And Heather, you, all three of you are great about being opinionated, and you don't mind nothing, you never put anything that's watered down or feels like it's just a statement of here's what we're doing. Heather, you've got a challenge, I would think, in that you're recruiting people to come work for you. You're also trying to partner with a lot of places that have a lot of bureaucracies. I'm curious, how much voice can you put out there without, how much can you push things without being worried about, am I pissing off the wrong people?
Sure. I mean, that's a very real concern for a startup at the phase that we're at, where we covet every new institutional customer. And so that's a real thing. But on the other hand, even though we're taking on a very daunting task of selling licenses into universities and institutions, we still want to attract the early adopters and the people who are ready for something different, who are seeking out better technology and truly, evolving the teaching and learning experience. So I can only be authentic. I can only be myself. And when I try to water that down, it doesn't usually result in anything very compelling. So I just figured just put it out there.
Right.
And the folks that are ready for us and like-minded and are really prospective customers will gravitate towards us. And that's really worked out. I mean, I go to conferences now and people will say, hey, I'm a follower and I read your posts and I really enjoy them. And people even told me that they missed my posts in August.
Yeah.
And I was shocked.
You should be writing more. Absolutely, I agree
Yeah.
with them. Hunter, what do you think about the idea? Now that you're running your own company, especially in your format, you have to attract talent. You've got to go after startups.
Yeah, I've always found fence sitting to be anatomically painful, and so I think having a point of view, but also being willing to admit when you're wrong, is more important than ending every sentence with a question mark or the "What do you think?" When I was at Google, I was careful to not write at length about things that Google was doing that weren't my domain, and I also had to show some. Probably restraint in terms of writing about companies that might be considered directly competitive, not because I was worried about the Google reaction, but because sometimes in a curation world or a Twitter world, those things get misreduced to Twitter executive says, company X
Right.
sucks. And so I actually find it more freeing now being out in the venture world for two reasons. One, I don't have those same obligations to know that I might be speaking for 50,000 other people. I'm speaking for myself and my partner. And second, it's a new experience for me as well. And so I vowed to be as transparent in sort of building my startup as I would be if I was building a standalone operating company. And somebody said, well, look, you've said this thing that's about this company, and maybe one day you're sitting across from them because you're trying to get them to partner or buy from one of your portfolio companies. And geez, I just don't know how to live a life where you're constantly playing defense. And so I try to be consistent and respectful. I don't feel the need to jump on every piece of news and weigh in. When Microsoft announced that there was going to be a CEO transition, I had nothing to say there. I got approached by one or two of the sort of tech blogs saying they wanted to do a roundup of tech personalities commenting, and I chose not to do that because I don't have anything new or novel or interesting to say. And so I think if you stick to the places where you want to, even if you're being critical, be constructive and come from a place of sort of love rather than somebody who measures. If you measure your success in this medium only by retweets and page views or even sort of LinkedIn page views, you can sometimes end up chasing voices that aren't necessarily your own. And so I think it's important to stay true to understand understanding what's the message you want to get across, and interact with that audience rather than letting that audience just take you to where sort of they want to see you.
I think it's a great point about how you measure success in this. If you're just measuring it on your own personality, then you're probably not getting the most out of it. I'm curious, how do you guys measure success? And we talked a little bit about this. Yeah. It's difficult. What do you do?
It is. The last article I posted was the first of a 5-part series about holistic assessment. And I thought, gosh, nobody's going to read this. This is going to be a bomb. And I was just terrified of that. I wasn't terrified of people disagreeing with what I had to say, but just not being engaged. And 40 comments later, people were, really have strong feelings about standardized tests and traditional assessment, more holistic assessment, how it's used used for benefit or for against people, and so people really kept going. And I think I shared with you that I don't feel the need to kind of interject once I've posted, but I read and study all of the different comments because I learned so much. And so I'm relieved when people just kind of add their own body of knowledge and keep building on the ideas, whether they contradict or disagree with me or not. But my biggest fear, honestly, is just that they are not going to respond. Right. That it's just going to be too specific or uninteresting. And that hasn't happened yet. But I think the thing is, when you're true to something that you authentically are passionate about, like healthcare reform or education or startup worlds, as you just kind of share your insights, I find that people are so hungry for some more insight into that world.
Absolutely.
And you were sort of talking before about your experiences in journalism and sometimes lack of engagement around that. And I think it has a lot to do with, journalism has traditionally been sort of pulpit content.
Right.
It's something that is spoken from to others, and I think the kind of content that we all contribute and LinkedIn in general, it's always struck me it's more like jazz. It's something where you're creating something, you're probably riffing off somebody else, and what you're hoping is that other people riff off you. And so it's a format that I think by nature is just more participatory and open than a lot of the other forms that press releases or speech giving might take.
Esther, you certainly experienced. Esther did an amazing story after the Hyperloop was after Elon Musk talked about the Hyperloop, and Esther did a really nice look, is this thing even realistic? Here is why. Here is my take on it. And I think it ended up with 500,000 views. Bloomberg called and they got her on TV for an hour to talk about this, and it started an amazing conversation. And I know that there were a lot of people that pushed back pretty hard on you. So how do you measure? How were you debating? What made you decide that was something you did want to weigh in, and how were you measuring whether that was worth your time to do it?
Yeah, well, so going back to what you said, I like to weigh in when what I have to say is not redundant, and ideally something where I bring something as an individual to it, whether, in this case, I started out my career with FedEx. I've thought a lot about transportation and logistics, and I thought people were missing the point, which was the business model as opposed to the technology. Right. So I said something that I didn't actually see anywhere else, and that made me proud, and evidently it provoked a lot of comment. Yep. Most recently, I rode in a Google self-driving car, and it so happens I don't know how to drive. So I compared the self-driving car to my friends who text while they're driving, who lose their tempers, who have hangovers, or taxi drivers who are talking to their girlfriends on cell phone. Whereas most people compare that car to their idealized vision of their own driving, which is, of course, perfect.
Right.
So again, I had a very different point of view that I thought was constructive and useful, and so I measure my success by, number one, is it different? And two, yes, do I learn something from the comments? Because, and they're fun to read, and some of them are crazy, but some of them are, you usually end up learning something you didn't know or something you didn't think about from again, a good audience.
That's great.
The ROI question comes up a lot. It's interesting, and we used to face that a lot at YouTube in the early days, especially because creating video is even harder, I think, than text. And I'll tell a quick little anecdote. In 2007, it was really when politicians were starting to understand the power of the platform. And I used to have these meetings, and maybe sort of the campaign director or the digital director, and then the social media associate or intern would come in, and we'd sit down, and the campaign director would sort of have their papers and charts in front of them, and they'd say, this is the year we're thinking about using YouTube, and then wait for me to sort of pitch them about all the things we were going to do for them. And I'd sort of pause and I'd say, really, that's strange. You're already on YouTube. And they'd sort of get a little more of a panicked look, and they'd turn to their social media intern and say, I didn't authorize this. And while they're saying that, I'd turn the screen towards them, and I'd type in the candidate's name, and I'd hit return, and you'd just see search result after search result after search result of their candidates' speeches, commercials being uploaded, news organizations, them on talk shows, people uploading their own videos talking about pro, con. And my answer was always, your candidate's already on YouTube. You just have to decide if you want to be part of the conversation.
Great point.
I had a near 100% conversion rate after that meeting. And what was interesting to see, so that 07, that conversation was with politicians. 08, that was with entertainers. 09, that was with advertisers. And I think the type of content marketing we're talking about today is very much the same thing. Whether it's within LinkedIn or just across the web, there are conversations going on about you, about your companies, about your issues every day. It's just a question about whether or not you want to be part of that conversation.
That's a terrific point. There is no way to hide. There's no place to hide anymore. People are going to talk about you, and either you are part of it, helping steer the conversation, or you're not. But people are going to keep talking. So, Heather, would you weigh in a little bit more on the ROI question, though?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But I can't agree enough about what Hunter just said in terms of being able to frame the conversation, how valuable that is. So that's a number one benefit, certainly, and more broadly speaking. But I see in a very tangible, literal way conversion from not only some followers, but people who then feel the need to connect with me and have specific conversations with me that end up in relationships as customers, as advisors, or in some other capacity. So, and I've seen that kind of that kind of funneling process as a result of every single post that I've made. So there's a very specific return on investment that I'm seeing just in getting actual customers.
Got it.
Raise hands. Is the ROI question seems to be a big deal. I assume that comes out. Is there anyone in this audience who's concerned about the ROI of content marketing? Okay, so I see a few hands.
Thank you.
How many people have gone to a conference, at least one conference, not counting this one, this past year, and had to get on an airplane to do it? Everybody, right? So for the time it takes to drive to the airport and park and go to a conference where you might talk to how many people, a few dozen, or if you're on stage, a few hundred, maybe a few thousand. You're reaching multiples of that via your content in a way that is in your words and can be passed around and is evergreen. And so the only reason to worry about ROI is if you think you can't create, if you don't have anything to say. And if you don't have anything to say, you probably have bigger issues, which we can talk about afterwards. But it's really, this type of stuff's a muscle, and it's only going to get more important as it gets harder and harder to force people to pay attention to you if they don't want to. You can't interrupt their experiences anymore. And so, if you haven't started yet, it's a muscle that you need to start training. Because if we're having this conversation 2, 3, 5 years from now, it's going to look more important to your business. And I've been blown away by just within the last year how important LinkedIn has become as a channel, just not for us, but for a number of our colleagues.
Yeah, great.
But it's a very important muscle, but it's really important for it to be good.
Absolutely.
Again, you really want people to read this stuff because they want to learn something, not because, it has to not be written by, the PR department. It needs to be written by a human being. Sometimes I get on airplanes and I sit next to someone and I'm not sure I like them. And so what I do is I ask them about themselves. And usually they turn out to be pretty nice. They're individuals with problems, or they do something interesting, but the moment you see them as a human being rather than as the guy who put his elbow on my
Your armrest.
Yeah.
So that ability to be human and vulnerable is too corny of a word, but authentic, representing whatever it is you represent. Why are you representing this company, this brand, this product? And if you don't know why, then, as Hunter said, other problems.
What's really interesting about that too is, so I think that also doesn't always mean take your CEO and try to turn them into a personality.
If they're not.
Yep.
There might be other executives within a company who can speak articulately and ongoing on behalf, and that person, representing the company and helping to elevate themselves using platforms like LinkedIn to help them maybe sort of punch above their weight in terms of not being the CEO, I think can be as valuable or even more valuable than trying to take somebody and encourage them to do something that they're just not good at or don't want to spend the time doing.
Yeah, and I would build on both those comments to say that I also think that not just viewing the posts as a commercial for your company, like you said, Esther, it not being about PR, but really sharing the insights that you get to have from your vantage point. I mean, I feel like it's almost a responsibility. I get to see a lot of different kinds of learning environments and things that work and don't work, and talk about blended learning or whatever the topic is, and I can share my insights and I can learn from other folks, but that's only if I'm just willing to give generously and about the issues in general, and not to try to just talk about portfolio learning and how Pathbrite is the best platform. That's not the point. And so I think it's very important it not be a commercial. To Hunter's point, we're bringing in our first chief scientist who really can do things with data, structured data and unstructured data from the learners, and develop learning analytics that we're not able to do. And so she has a whole expertise that is so separate from what I see and how I see the world that she absolutely needs to share that in her own way, her understandings of big data and things that I barely track. And she has her own perspective about the implications for that in terms of learning in the future. And so I think it's very wonderful when folks within the team can share their own kind of insights, because they're going to be different from the CEOs.
Very hard, though, for companies, I think, to embrace that idea of letting the voice out of someone who is at a different level, and should they be thought leaders? What do you guys think of this? Do you have something else you want to say?
Yeah, exactly on this
Okay.
point. I mean, in this, quote, modern world, I would be really suspicious of a company that didn't have enough self-awareness and courage to let someone other than the CEO speak. And from the point of view of the customers, whatever it is, I think they would love to hear from the people who are making the product, or the science behind it, or tales of a barista. How is it that we make the coffee hot enough? It's just fascinating to know behind the scenes what's going on. I love one thing about running conferences. Usually you get FedEx packages, and somehow they're always on the other side of the kitchen. Try it. I love walking through hotel kitchens and looking at what they're doing. It's usually fascinating. In some foreign countries, they have pictures of a hamburger and French fries so that the people know how to put them on the plate. But you can learn so much about a company by watching the sausage being made, and having a couple of people who do that for the customers. Not everybody's going to read it, but it gives people a sense that this company has a soul, and they care about their product, and they respect their people.
So, one of Hunter, one of my favorite things that you've done as an influencer was he did a series on early employees at startups. And he interviewed people who had joined with a third employee at, what are some of the companies? eBay? And,
Electronic Arts, Yahoo, eBay.
Why did you decide to join? How did you decide to make this leap? What were those early days like? And they were real insights. These are people you might not have ever heard of, but they were the ones who made the decision to back the crazy founders.
They tell the real stories. The founders and the PR around the founders sort of end up telling the mythic story, and then you have the person who was there 7 and is like, oh my God, those first few years were a total mess.
And it's all back to the authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun because I was a history major in undergrad and always sort of did the student newspaper and that type of stuff. And so it was fun getting to sort of scratch that itch a little bit again and look for stories that I thought weren't out there. For 2 reasons. One, sort of I just mentioned, you hear different stories and things that hadn't been told before. But the second is, I think for the average person, it's much easier to imagine working for the next Google than starting the next Google. I mean, entrepreneurism in general is fantastic. I mean, I'm in the business of backing people who want to start the next Google. So, I depend on a steady flow of bright, intelligent people wanting to take that risk. But the idea of being able to join something early that then becomes big and wonderful, especially out here in the Valley, is an even more sort of commonly experienced dream. And so, wanting to sort of make it accessible and help people sort of pattern match and understand that this is another path towards making an impact. And also, once I figured out who I wanted to interview, I just sent them 7 questions. They reply via email, and I just cut and paste.
It was great, and it wasn't about you. You were the one putting it out there. You got people were following you because they would get this interesting content, but it wasn't you weren't selling yourself.
Ultimately, what you're doing is you're not just publishing under your byline. You're creating a subscriber base, a follower base that is open to hearing content that you find interesting or content that's thematically interesting. And I find that you can use that for a number of different opportunities, whether it be interviews, guest posts, so on and so forth. I mean, I don't look at it as Hunter Walk is a lifestyle brand, but I do feel like I have.
I'm wearing all Hunter right now.
That's phase 3. I do feel that I have an opportunity to introduce the folks who follow me to other things or other people that they hadn't heard of. One of the things across platforms, whether it be LinkedIn or others, that I really enjoy doing is I found one of the most enjoyable things about getting to a base where there's people who follow me are that I can try to help some voices that I think are actually really, really interesting, but for whatever reason, underheard. I can help elevate those. And there's nothing more thrilling than sort of doing that and then seeing that person, find their own voice, find their own follower base.
Absolutely. The power to be a creator and a curator, I think, is you should never be just one or the other. And I think that's true for brands as much as is true for individuals. We have some time for questions. I want to make sure that we get to the audience. So, you, sir.
Somebody's enthusiastic.
I'm Bob Sherbin from NVIDIA. I have a question about you in your role as influencers and in your role as individuals who are of public interest. How has your activity in LinkedIn affected your dealings with the media? And I don't mean as a consumer of media. I mean as a subject of media. Has it made the media less important for you? Has it made them more important for you because they're more aware of you?
Good question. No one to take that?
Well, I will say I'm probably the kind of youngest from this perspective in terms of getting media attention. I would say that it's been very helpful for getting us on the radar of other media, other reporters and such, because they actually can go back and kind of read all of my posts. And there's certainly a tone and some thread to what I'm talking about. So I think they get a flavor for my point of view and what I'm about, that they can, at their leisure and from wherever, kind of catch up and then decide that they indeed wanted to cover us and do an article or something. So I would say it's definitely helped me from the perspective of not just getting coverage, when I'm speaking at a conference, but in a more kind of cost-efficient way.
For me, so Dan mentioned the Hyperloop thing. That was great. I'm a little hard to place, and so people tend not to think of me about things. They didn't actually call me about Steve Ballmer, but so LinkedIn gives me the opportunity to have a presence, if I want one, on something where I think I can add to the discussion, and then it's easier for the media to find me. In terms of using it for HICCup, which is what I'm hoping to do, I can see it just being very helpful in terms of creating a presence and identity. I'm about to embark basically on a year-long education visiting lots of small communities in the United States. And as you said, communities where people are doing amazing things and deserve visibility. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'll add, obviously helpful in terms of just folks being familiar with my name, but I'd say 2 other subtle things. First is I've found that many more sort of, I'd say, like passive coverage. So if a journalist is writing an overall trend story or covering something, I'll sort of all of a sudden find that they had linked to something in LinkedIn that I wrote, without sort of having to know that I also blog somewhere else or wherever. They're just, the content is out there, and so the journalists are keeping it top of mind. And the second is, from like business school, like the BATNA, like your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, right? It always is sort of your fallback. So it used to be that if I had an opinion and I wanted to get something heard, I sort of had to play by the rules of the journalist of, okay, I'll guest post this on your site, or I'll sit down and do an interview even if I didn't want to. So my BATNA, is always sort of publishing it myself. So it allows me to be more picky about when I want to publish outside of LinkedIn or outside of my own blog, and I think that allows me to make better use of sort of the time I spend publicly.
There's also such demand for content now from any publisher that a lot of times we get publishers who reach out to us and say, can we reprint this from one of the influencers? This happens with Hunter all the time. You'll see his posts on Business Insider because they've seen something they like, and they say, we want to show this to our audience as well.
We've just had to help them with attribution.
Yes, we've worked that closely. Remind them they need to link back. So,
And I bet they write new
that takes some work.
Yeah.
What else?
Oh,
Other
yes.
questions? Go ahead. Oh, can you wait for this is being streamed, so we want to make sure you get on the microphone. And can you introduce yourself also?
Sure. My name's Chris. I work for Cisco. I'm curious to know, for you panelists as individuals and professionals, when, where, and by whom you're influenced. What are your sources, and how has that shaped your careers?
Who the panelists have been influenced by? Is that what the question?
Yeah, and also just on an ongoing basis. I mean, we're talking about the power that influencers have. What influencers have shaped you, and what is your source?
Well, I will confess that I was probably one of the early followers of Richard Branson. He's just one of my business idols in terms of just charting a new path and thinking big and just being direct and out there about that. So I think as soon as the influencer capability came on board and he started posting, I was tracking his work. You guys should chime in. But there are a lot of people, so I'll keep thinking about it. But you guys should chime in.
I'm total contrarian. So I don't think I follow anybody who's in the top quartile. Part of that's because I'm trying to pass them.
Exactly.
But very competitive. But mostly because I feel like a lot of those folks, and they some of their content's great, but I already know who those people are. And what's most interesting for me, across sort of blogs in general, and especially within LinkedIn, is that there's folks who are real subject experts who I didn't know about, who are writing only on this platform, and I know who are actually 100% doing the writing themselves, and always teaching me something new. And so I tend to sort of follow like the bottom of the influencers more than the top.
I keep doing new things, so my influencers kind of change over time. Right now, I'm just starting to follow people in the health field, and I'm kind of the opposite of a fire hose. I'm a Dyson vacuum. I'm sucking everything up, and some of them are on LinkedIn, some aren't. Maybe I should be more aggressive about encouraging them to do that. But most of what I'm interested in is really at the edge. So I find obscure people who are doing population health, or somebody who's running a obesity program in High Point, North Carolina, or something like that. And kind of what you said, I'd really like to start interviewing them and giving them some visibility, because the field I'm working in is something that actually needs more visibility inside Silicon Valley, where we all have Lexuses and Priuses and are thinking about self-driving cars. There are a lot of people who can't afford cars. And I don't mean to sound corny, but figuring out how to fix that so that we don't pay taxes to pay for their health care.
That's great. Some questions in the back here?
Yes, Jeff Roars with Exact Target. Since you're in the influencer program, look ahead, and what do you hope it will evolve into, or what feature functionality or direct access to your audience do you hope it might have in the future?
Oh, I've sent lists of these.
I get this every day from Hunter. Go ahead.
I think for my purposes, I'd like to see the influencer program more connected to the rest of the LinkedIn experience. So for example, when I'm meeting somebody or I see a profile, I'd like to know, have they commented on my post before? Are they a follower? But put a bunch of sort of that relationship primary. I mean, it was sort of Dan's slide about content being the ultimate icebreaker. The influencer section still feels, although it's cross-promoted, from a functionality standpoint, it still feels pretty disconnected from the rest of the experience. And for me to, I use LinkedIn not just as a network, but almost as an evergreen address book, because I know that I can just sort of connect with somebody, and then no matter where they go through their career, I'll always sort of be able to track them through LinkedIn. And so since some of those ties can be a little bit weaker, I'm not talking to them on a weekly basis because of my work, I do want to be able to sort of be reminded of those points of interaction.
Yeah, I kind of feel that really I should sit down and spend a day exploring LinkedIn so that I understand better what it's already doing that I just didn't know about. But at the same time, it should be doing some of that for me. So I have this HICCup group, and then I also have my influencer posts, and I have a whole bunch of friends. How to sort of draw social graphs, surface things more automatically, put in a more text understanding, so that it just becomes more alive rather than something you need to search. It needs to be something that surfaces stuff for you without at the same time spamming you.
Right.
And that's a technical challenge I understand very well. The other thing I would love to see is some more technology around not the commenting, but in the commenting space, the ability to run polls, to do. There's a pretty high barrier to commenting, and often the comments aren't, some of them are great, some of them are not. But if you gave people the ability, for example, to ask questions and then have yes or no or multiple choice answers, you could get a much better sense of opinions, reactions. You'd get more people engaged because they don't need to write something, but they can still register, have you too ever done X? How many of you had an experience in a car accident? Was it your fault? I mean, I don't know what, but engage people through data as
Right.
well as commenting.
One thing we found, just as an aside, is that when we allow that poll functionality in groups, it turns out people that leave bad comments are also equally as bad as making polls. So sometimes you have great polls, and then you have really rough
Okay,
ones
sure,
as well.
I'm
But
sure.
anyway, sorry,
Yeah.
I think these are all great. So I think the takeaway here is it's perfect, and don't want any changes. It's great. What other
Just
questions?
getting more perfect.
What other questions are out there?
I have a question for you, Dan.
Wait, we got one from the audience.
Hi, Abner Germano from Juniper Networks. So we've talked a lot about things that worked, and Dan told us about a few things originally that didn't work. Anything that you thought was going to work that bombed?
Great question. Tell you what you think about that. Let me start with the bomb what we've experienced on LinkedIn when people have bombed. There have been influencers that bomb all the time. There have been some, though. What's great about this, and I think what's true of doing any kind of content if a company creates, is that you instantly know if you bomb. And usually people in the company who are the most authentic know that something is going to bomb. So we've had people do a post saying, we're teaming up with another company to launch a new venture around X, Y, and Z. And they're like, all right, go promote this. How come this isn't getting 50,000 views? And what's great is you can say, no one cares. Only you care about this, or this other company you're partnering with, and usually they don't really care either. And there's nothing in it, there's no takeaway. This is about you, it's not about the reader. It's not what someone can take away from it. So the feedback is instant. It's phenomenal. And it doesn't mean that as an editor, I used to have to tell people all the time, your story sucks, I'm sorry to tell you that. Now, we let the data do the talking for us. No one's reading your post, and I'll tell you why no one's reading it. All right, you guys have examples?
For me, it's not so much bombed as just, I sometimes find some posts are way more successful than I expected them to be, and some that I'm especially proud of, just from a short numbers standpoint, aren't. But then I sort of have to pull myself back and be like, oh, it's really about sort of wanting to put this out there and see what people think. It's not about trying to sort of write to a particular target or something like that.
Or maybe you are writing to a target, and if 10 people, but they're the people who can really give you useful feedback, or it's not always quantity. And again, that's why I like the LinkedIn audience. It's not, how shall I say this politely? It's not just a huge mass of people. It's people with professional interest. You can find out who they are, and again, the ability. I mean, I still like the targeting that I don't think has surfaced enough of, how could I in fact target this to hospital administrators or something like that?
I think that would be a great feature capability if there were more ways of kind of offering up the posts to people that you think would be interested, but maybe haven't discovered your site yet. I haven't had a real bad bomb, although, what I would say is I think that this is an early enough experience that there are probably going to be new thresholds for success around the experience that we're just not even aware of yet. This has really exceeded my expectations so far. And I really like what does really work for me is the dashboard, where I can check exactly how many folks have engaged and compare each post against each other. And so, but I think it's so early that I haven't had a terrible bomb yet. I'm sure it's going to happen, but hopefully there will be other things that really do exceed our expectations in the future.
Don't blog when drunk or angry, and you'll be okay.
I don't even tweet when I do, so that's not going to happen.
What else? Any other questions? Go ahead. Oh, can you wait for the microphone? Sorry. It's coming.
Roberto Bute from Bridge Local. Thank you. Great insights, by the way. And I guess my question is more about how can the platform protect the identities of, let's say, employees that might be interested in sharing the real insights of companies. And obviously, we live in a world that is not ideal or far from it. And you may want to tell the truth about XYZ processes that you might not be happy with, but then ends up, costing you your job, or maybe you go from being a manager to being a assistant manager. So I mean, because
it's a great question.
The beauty of social media, if we put it in a context of how people speak, is it's developing that comfort. I tell the truth, I get feedback, I can go home afterwards, have dinner, and it's over. As opposed to now, oh shoot.
The world is taking what you've written and run with it.
Right. So how can we find that balance?
Yeah. Esther, go ahead.
So there's a book. It's called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty by A.O. Hirschman. It was written, I think, in 1950 or something. But this is a real problem, whether it's a company or a campaign. And I don't know what the LinkedIn answer is. The personal answer is, if it's bad enough, you should leave. I mean, and if it's good enough, if you can't talk about it to your manager or someone else in the company, then everybody has the choice of leaving and then posting about it on LinkedIn. But I mean, it's
Esther, would you encourage everyone that you work with and any portfolio company, would you say they should all be writing and sharing all the time, or do you think that there is a danger in giving, when you give people a megaphone, when you give people the ability to always, and we're saying you always have to broadcast, you got to make yourself into a thought leader, don't you also run the danger of them exposing something by accident that ends up costing them?
Well, I mean, there's unfortunately, the world isn't composed of grown-ups. It's actually composed of people you went to high school with. And
That's a great line.
but a good company can survive it and is not doing anything so bad that, I mean, people need judgment. You don't have an argument in front of the children or in front of the clients, and if you do, it's not transparency, it's bad manners. But it kind of goes back to the previous question. If your product isn't interesting enough, you know, if your problem is so bad that you want to talk about it publicly and that's the only way to get it fixed, that may be the right thing to do, even at the expense of your career. But there are probably other better companies that are willing to hire you. The transparency is, in fact, a social benefit. And it costs something to do this. It requires courage, and it costs something, and if you have a family, it costs something. But at the same time, I think, and LinkedIn may not be the place to do it. Maybe you need to call the New York Times. But if it's simply there's a bad manager, then if the company doesn't take care of it itself, it's a bad company. And so,
Well, Heather,
I'm not answering very well.
No,
but
it's a great answer.
because
You're
it's such
pointing
a
out when there are real
meaningful-
problems in a company that need to be exposed. My guess is that I think a bigger problem, though, is people exposing stuff by accident. They didn't
Yeah.
know they shouldn't have been sharing.
And,
But Heather, would you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that?
I mean, at a portfolio company, Pathbrite Portfolios, we think a lot about identity management. And the world of identity management is evolving rapidly right now. And so, for example, in our environment, we really encourage learners of all ages, people of all ages, to be very thoughtful about what's for private consumption and private curation and private benefit, what should be shared with trusted advisors, counselors, teachers, parents, other folks like that, and then what's ready for prime time digital universe. You can't retrieve it. It is going to be there long after you're gone. And I think that I'm a big believer in transparency, and I definitely believe in, you know, whistleblowing at the right time and lots of other activities. But at an individual level, I think it's very important that people be very cognizant of what it is that they're sharing out there and the ramifications of it, and managing their identities appropriately. There's a big issue also just in terms of having, you know, personal emails attached to professional places, and I think that there's a lot more that software is going to do to give the individual user total choice around what they share and what types of communities, how they're viewed. But it's a big thing that people should be very, I think, very cognizant of, very aware of, and have that kind of muscle of what's appropriate for what audiences.
So I think the takeaway is the gates are open. As a company, you've got to figure out how to train people to that fact.
I'd say don't create process. You know, if you're talking about something that's going to happen 1 out of 10,000 times, don't create a process that is optimized for blocking that one. Create processes that are going to allow all the good to happen, and then help people avoid, you know, that 1 in 10,000 incident. And when it occurs, you know, just fix it, as opposed to, you know, not allowing, you know, this type of conversation to occur.
Yeah, apologize and move on, and create a culture where those mistakes are unlikely and won't hurt you, because whatever the information is, it's not that damaging.
That's great. We are keeping people from lunch, so
Oh, dear.
I'm going to wrap things up here. What some of the takeaways: be authentic, be transparent, find your voice and make sure you're sharing it, make sure everyone in your company is sharing it as well. Thank you guys so much for coming up here. This was great. Thank you all. Enjoy your lunch.